throw it in. Yeah. Okay. Well, we still technically have a minute, but it's good to see everybody here today. We've had some nice weather. Not really like Christmas time, but it'll get colder, I'm sure. Things are progressing at the house, but I don't know that Christmas is going to be a realistic deadline. It's awfully close. It'll happen. We might be sleeping on mattresses, but we got another wall missing in it now. It was there yesterday, but it's not by the end of yesterday. It was gone. So,
Hope it's not an outside wall.
it's not an outside wall yet. It almost became one, but it is outside now. It's out in the garage. It's going to get into something. It's been a labor of love. I'll tell you. It's really. I am 64, almost 65 years old, and this is the first house I've ever owned, and I just demolished it inside. I don't know why somebody would try to take that on. Everybody I've ever talked to that talk about remodeling said, "Do not do it."
Mm-hmm.
It's okay. Okay, Acts, lesson 22. We're going to finish Acts up today. It's going to end rather abruptly, too. Chapters 27 and 28 of Acts. Luke is with Paul. We learn that from the we statements that it has, and we also learn it, we'll see at the end of this lesson, we'll learn it from the prison epistles. After Paul ended up in Rome, he wrote 4 epistles while he was in prison, and in one of those he mentions Luke being with him. So kind of an outline that we have. Yeah, try to use this.
Oh, wait a second. Just a second.
Hang on just a second. There we go. It's going to start off. Paul has been in prison in Caesarea for a couple of years now. He's gone through 3 or 4 three trials in Caesarea, one in Jerusalem, and they wanted him to ask him if he wanted to go back to Jerusalem. Of course, he knows that they're trying to kill him in Jerusalem, so he appeals to Caesar, and so now to Caesar he's going to go. And it says when it was decided that we should sail for Italy. So Paul's going to sail for Italy. They're going to have, of course, this is the Apostle Paul, right? And God has already told him that he's going to testify in Jerusalem. So we know this is going to be just a jump on a yacht, sail to Rome, testify to Caesar. No problems, everything goes well with Paul, right? We're going to find an amazing story there. Should have stayed in Crete. That's what Paul was going to tell him. That's probably the only time that you see in his writings where he said, "I told you so." But they're going to shipwreck. They're going to incur injury and loss. They're going to end up on a little island that they didn't even know what the name was until they got there, called Malta. They're going to be there for 3 months. Finally going to finish the trip to Italy, and then he's going to be in Rome. It ends with him saying that he's been in Rome for 2 years at his own expense. This may be his first imprisonment that they let him loose, and you hear the different stories about him going to Spain and stuff after that. From some of the letters that he wrote to Timothy and stuff, that could be the case. I haven't exactly figured out how that sequence would work, but we don't have a lot of information about that. So some of that's probably tradition or speculation, but we won't go there today. Anyway, Paul sails for Italy. It says he's going to get on a ship of Adramyttium. I've got a map up here. It's going to show where that is. Adramyttium is this.
Maybe almost dead.
There we go. Adramyttium is here. This ship is going to leave Caesarea and is going to put in its Sidon, and then it was going to go along the port to Adramyttium. So we know he's going to have to change ships. But right away, they start having a little trouble with the wind being against them. My dad was a sailor, and I'm not. I sailed with him one time, and I said, that's scary enough for me to stay off the ocean. He liked sailing out there where he couldn't see land for weeks at a time. But these ships back then, they were probably bigger or about the same size as one my dad sailed around in. Dad says they look really big in port. When you get them out in the open ocean, they feel like a cork. But these are the prevailing winds for sailing in the Mediterranean. This wind that they were supposed to catch is called the Sirocco. It's supposed to be one that blows from the south and would carry them very well to the ports where they were going to go. Right off, we can only guess, but because it doesn't say, but they have a wind that is against them. I don't know if y'all have ever been sailing, but you can sail with the wind, or you can tack sort of into the wind. Tack is going back and forth. The one thing you can't do is sail directly into a wind. It doesn't work. And so the only direction this wind could be blowing is from the west. The wind doesn't hardly ever blow from the west in the eastern Mediterranean. It blows from the deserts in the south, and it blows from the mountains in the north, but it doesn't ever blow from the west. Right away, they hit a west wind, and they're struggling from the time they leave Sidon till the time that they get to this other ship that I don't know why this thing doesn't want to pronounce it. They're going to sail around to that where that black arrow is, basically. So the green arrow is the wind that they should have gotten. The red arrow is a wind that they did get. And so this makes their trip many, many days and many, many miles longer and harder. It's interesting that right off we see the centurion treating Paul kindly and lets him go ashore at Sidon and meet with the brothers and have his needs cared for. I don't know what that implies when he said they had to have his needs cared for, whether Paul is beginning to age and has been in prison and has maybe contracted an illness or a sickness. I'm just speculating on these kind of things, but the centurion, it was kind of like Joseph. Remember when Joseph was in prison? And even when he got down there, Potiphar realized there was something unique about Joseph, and he treated him kindly, and he put him in charge of a lot of things. This centurion, even though he's got other prisoners on this ship, and one of those prisoners is Aristarchus, which it says accompanied Paul, but we learn that he's a prisoner later on in Colossians, we learned that he's a prisoner with Paul. So Aristarchus is a friend of Paul's, but then this centurion, lets this prisoner free to go to the land and get his needs cared for him by the brothers. So that's a very interesting point too. And then they get around they sailed, very difficult, they said, sailing around the coast like that because you're sailing into the wind. They're having to sail on the lee of islands, which is the island blocks the wind, and they sail around the side that the wind doesn't blow on. So they sail around there and they get to this place called Nilus, and they're going to change ships at a city called Myra. So they're going to change into an Alexandrian ship that's apparently a merchant vessel, and they're going to sail from there. Apparently, they're going to try for Rome. This wind is still blowing. Even after many days, this strong west wind is still blowing, and they're trying to sail on the lee of some of these islands in order to make any movement. They're going to have to tack into the wind going to Crete, and then they said with difficulty, they came around to a place called Fair Havens.
That's pretty high for today.
A lot of time has gone by. A lot of time has gone by, and this wind, they're waiting for this wind to die down because this is a very unusual thing. But they could not winter in this harbor for whatever reason because of the way that the wind was blowing. They couldn't harbor there. So they were going to try to make it just a little bit farther up the island to Phoenix, where there was a suitable harbor for them to spend the winter at. Paul tells them at this point, I can tell you that this voyage is going to end with a lot of loss and a lot of injury if you sail away from here. You need to stay here. Well, profit overrides their sailor sense. The majority of them decide to vote for going on to this next port. They thought they caught a nice, soft southern wind coming up, and then that meant that they were going to be able to just sail just a few, maybe 45, 50 miles is all they had to go to reach this other port. Paul told them not to, and just shortly after they left there, this other wind, that black line there, they have a name for that wind too. It's called a Melteri. And it comes out of the northeast, and it blows hard, and it blows with gale force winds that disrupt shipping all the time in the Mediterranean. So you can tell with this little sailboat that a gale force wind is, these boats are not, they're not made to withstand that. They don't get very far out of port till this wind catches them. Y'all can come in. Come on in. Come on in. Yeah, we're just getting started with Acts. We're talking about his sailing trip, Paul's sailing trip to Italy. Good to have you. So they're not very far out of port, and this wind catches them off guard, and it blows them. And the only way you can do when you catch a really bad wind that you can't do anything with in the open ocean is just drop your sails and just run with the wind. And that's what they did. And then they got to a place down there, number 13, you'll see on that map, the Syrtis Banks. They've been blowing so far southwest that they were worried about running aground on these different rocks and stuff. They had got the lifeboat on board so that it's not dragging behind them. They put ropes underneath the ship to try to hold the ship together. They were doing everything they could to make this disaster survivable. But it kept going and it kept going. And from the text that they see that they'd been without food for a long time, that they had lowered all of their gear, that's their sails and stuff. They jettisoned cargo, and on the third day they threw ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. And so these guys are losing any hope of surviving this trip. Paul stands up, it says, in verse 21, stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete and incurred this injury or loss. But now I urge you to take heart, for there will be among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God, that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island." So for the first time, this is unlike Jonah, when Jonah's running from God, and Jonah stands up and tells about the God that he worships, and that this is being caused by that God, and that in order for it to stop, they need to throw him overboard. Paul gets reassured by an angel of God that he's going to stand before Caesar, and that there will be no loss of life because of him being on board. And so he testifies about God to these people. And they're being driven still across the sea. We see from this map that changing course and things. So, I'm not exactly sure how accurate that is, but I think they're going off of the prevailing winds that come off of Africa, start blowing a little bit to the northeast. You get some southwesterly winds coming off of the deserts of Africa there. And so that might be why they show them changing course. But anyway, they realize they're getting close to land because the soundings that they're taking are less and less each time. They're worried about running aground on the rocks, striking a reef, and so the soldiers want to kill the prisoners. Well, first the soldiers are going to try to escape. And Paul tells the centurion, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. It sounds like Jesus' words when he talked about the Galileans. Were they any worse sinners than anybody else when the tower fell on them and crushed them and killed a bunch of them? And he said, unless you repent, you cannot be saved. He said in another place in Luke 2, he said the same thing. Unless you believe that I am he and repent, you cannot be saved. This is Paul saying that same thing. My God has talked to me. And unless you stay in the ship, unless you do as I have instructed you, you cannot be saved. That's enough to convince the centurion, and so he keeps them all on board, and they cut away the life raft so that wouldn't happen again. They begin throwing even the wheat that this ship was carrying into the sea. So all of that profit that these guys have tried to make, the owner of the ship and the sailors that wanted to sail away can get the profit from the ship. This is all for naught. Everything's going overboard. And in the English translation and the English Standard Version, it has 276 persons on the ship. Some of the very early manuscripts say only 76 or about 76. So my guess is that in the fragment that they have, that first there's a little bit before the 76 that's missing. some translated as a 2, and some translated as 5. So anyway, the ship's got a lot of people on it. And they were all encouraged by what Paul had said, and they all took food and ate. They hadn't eaten for 14 days. Now, they drug the anchors, they threw the anchors out behind the boat and drug them so that they could wait until daylight so they could see where land was, and they cut the ropes for the rudder so that they could figure out how to maneuver into this island. Once day came and they were still alive and they could see where this beach was on this island, they cut everything loose and made for the beach. A lot of these islands have reefs out from the edges of them, and so you never make it all the way to the island. Your ship is going to get stuck and wreck on the reef. And that's what happened here. The ship was going to break up, and it was breaking apart. The soldiers want to kill the prisoners because in Rome, you remember, if they lose a prisoner, they get killed. Their prisoners are their life. If they lose a prisoner escapes, or maybe even if a prisoner dies while on their watch, they end up paying the price for that. So they want to kill the prisoners so that they don't end up themselves being killed by their superiors. The centurion wanted to save Paul, it says, and so he kept them from carrying out their plan and ordered those who could swim to jump overboard and the rest of them to grab pieces of the ship as it broke apart and float into the beach, to the island. And Luke records it so that all were brought safely to land, just as the angel had said to him, no loss of life. All 276 people on board were saved, but the ship was lost.
That was on the island of Malta, you said?
They learned that the name of this island is Malta. They didn't know what it was when they first landed, but then the native people came and helped them, and it was really interesting that Luke recorded that the natives of that island showed unusual kindness. Why would Luke write that, or how would Luke know that it was unusual kindness? Maybe they thought these guys are uncivilized barbarians, they're just going to kill us and eat us. But I don't know what they thought, but they showed them unusual kindness, and it was raining. They built a fire for them. They made sure that they were comfortable. While they're doing this fire thing, Paul's out gathering wood. He's not taking advantage of his position as a favorite of the centurion. He's being a prisoner along with the other prisoners. He's out gathering wood for the fires to keep the fires burning. And so as they're sitting around the fire, a snake comes out and bites Paul on the hand, latches onto his hand. Paul just shakes him off into the fire. So the people there are going, oh, this is a sign. This guy must be a murderer, and he's not escaped because, just because they had a wreck and the shipwreck and he's safe on land, he still gets bit by a snake. And so they're sitting around waiting for him to die. Swell up, get sick or something. And when that doesn't happen, he goes from being a murderer to being a god with one bite. Now, does this scene remind you of anything? Growing up in
vipers and Moses and the snake. Was it Moses that threw down the snake?
It was Moses that threw, well, it was Aaron that threw down his rod and turned it, and Moses did too. Now, Jesus said in Mark 16, 17, and 18, talked about these signs will accompany those who believe. I've never heard of it down here. I haven't been here that long, only 3 years now. But in Kentucky, they still have snake handlers in churches.
Mm-hmm.
They still believe that they can pick up snakes, get bitten by snakes, and that they won't get hurt by snakes, because Paul did. It's an apostolic example, so, you know, what do you say? This is an unusual situation. I don't think that that was meant for all people of all times, but this is one of the things that Jesus said, and these signs will accompany those who believe. And this is a serpent that bites Paul and doesn't affect him. But they're trying to make him into a god now, and we don't see the same reaction from Paul that we did when they tried to make him and Barnabas gods, of him reacting and running out into the crowd and saying, no, we're just men just like you are. Luke doesn't really record any of the actions that Paul does here. He goes right into, now in that neighborhood, the lands belonged to a chief man whose name was Publius, and his father was sick. So these guys think that, so they're going to take him to this sick man so that this God can heal him. And Paul does that. Paul goes and lays his hands on him and prayed. And when that had taken place, that he got better, and the people saw that, they started bringing sick people from all over. So we recognize these miracles as Paul's going to start. I know this is an assumption, but Paul's going to start preaching. He's not going to be silent through this whole thing. We've seen it in other places. Paul's going to start preaching. These signs aren't done by me. These are things that are done by God to confirm to you the message that I'm telling you is true. So it's a bit of an assumption on my part. I'm going to tell you that because it's not written there. But they started bringing people from everywhere, and he cured them. They honored him greatly, so when they were about to sail, they supplied all of their needs. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote that my father related to me while they were sailing in the South Pacific. There's a set of islands down there called the Marshall Islands, and all of the native kids there have been leaving the Marshall Islands and not returning because they're going out into the world, they're getting educated on mainlands and stuff like that, and then they're not coming back because there's nothing there for them to do. Well, about the time that my dad was sailing, him and a business partner of his were changing the computers in this guy's office, and they had 50 or so computers that they were going to just throw away. They decide, because the Marshall Island, and they'd been down there and they'd sailed this area before, and the older natives had told them about this problem. Well, one of the unique things about the Marshall Islands is that the Trans-Pacific communication cable travels right through there. And it comes up on land and goes back down into the sea. So these little tiny islands out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean have a super connection to the whole world through the web. So they take all these computers down there and they just give them away to the islanders, to the chiefs, to let them pass on to their kids. Get everything hooked up, spend months getting all of this stuff hooked up so these kids can stay in the islands and still be connected to the outside world. My dad said when they left there, that their boat would almost not float because of all of the fruit and vegetables and supplies that these people had to their boat, in gratitude for keeping their kids at home and yet letting them see what the world had to offer. So he said they just loaded the boat down full of all of the stuff from the island. They didn't have to resupply anything. And that was a story for me that's kind of similar to what we see here, because of the gratitude that these people had for what Paul had done for them. Excuse me. That they piled their boat full of everything that they needed. Now they're here for 3 months, so that they stayed, all these people stayed with them for this whole entire time. So now we got to finish the race. They leave Malta and they sail to Sicily, Syracuse, and then find another ship going into Rome, and they transfer that onto there. So they're going to make a couple more stops before they get to a place called, I love this word, Puccioli. They get to a place in Italy, and that's where they're going to unload all of this cargo. So finish the race. Yeah, Larry.
Let me ask you one question. Does it say anything? I never did read it in the scriptures about how they repaired their ship or how they made it on the system.
No, they found another ship. That does say that they found another ship that was going to be sailing, and another Alexandrian ship that was going to be sailing from that island that must have wintered there. Their ship was a total loss. Their ship was a total loss on the reefs and everything. But I think it says in verse 11, after 3 months we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria, and it even kind of identifies the ship with the twin gods as a figurehead. Some say Castor, some use just the twin gods. They stayed in Syracuse on Sicily for a little while, and then they made the circuit and arrived at the heel part of Italy, and after one day a south wind sprang up. On the second day we came to Puccioli, little Italian town. Okay. The first thing Paul does when he goes ashore is meet with the brothers. There were brothers there. Apparently there was a church there. And they stayed there for 7 days. Another one of those things where they stayed for 7 days, like they did at Troas. I think whenever we see that, maybe in Acts, there again, I'm making a few more assumptions that I maybe shouldn't relate as far as teaching, but it seems as though that whenever they stay at a place for 7 days, it's so that they can worship with them. They can take the time to spend that first day of the week and worship with that crowd. And then they came as far as the Forum of Appius and the Three Taverns, and the brothers came out of Rome to meet them that far down there. So the first thing we do is the brothers coming and the word getting out that they made the trip, and the brothers coming out to meet them. I think this says a lot about the Christians, because they didn't just wait until Paul arrived and then go see him. They were proactive in seeing that, they've been lost at sea for weeks, and they're going to be sick, they're going to be injured. We need to do something. They get together as a group and they go and they see that his needs are attended to, as well as I'm sure the others. So now then they come to Rome, and as we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. When he left for Italy, it doesn't say that Festus sent any charges with him. That's why he had Agrippa examine him, because they were trying to find charges. So now Paul's in Italy, and there still isn't anything that they have against him, to the point where Paul meets next with the Jewish leaders to get them to find out what they know. And he tells them, even though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our father, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. Because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case, but because the Jews objected, I was compelled. And they said to him, we have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken anything evil about you. So word about Paul had never made it to Rome in all of this time. In the 2 years that he'd been kept at Caesarea, the Roman Jews knew nothing about that. So Paul starts preaching the gospel. And as we see, he gets mixed results again. As usual, some believe, but some don't. He testified to the kingdom of God, trying to convince them both about Jesus and about the law of Moses and from the prophets. Some of them were convinced, but some of them weren't. After disagreeing with each other and themselves, Paul recites the original curse that God put on this people clear back in Isaiah. He said that what the Holy Spirit told Isaiah really is exactly right. It's saying, your fathers, go to this people and say, you will indeed hear, but never understand. You will indeed see, but you will never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, closed, lest they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I will heal them. Therefore, let it be known to you that this salvation, this is Paul's last word to the Jews. This salvation is going to the Gentiles, and they're going to listen. And then it just ends. And it says he lived there 2 whole years at his expense and welcomed all who came to him, and he preached for those entire 2 years. So this is the conclusion of these last 2 chapters. This was the lesson that I learned. Paul continues to suffer. We read a lot about suffering in the New Testament, about filling up the sufferings of Christ, about suffering as a Christian. Maybe I wish that I had read that when I was very early on. I thought that when I was baptized, all my troubles would go away.
It's dark.
Then a preacher said this one time, and I've used it ever since. Jesus didn't die so that we wouldn't suffer in this world. Jesus didn't die to solve all of our worldly problems. Jesus died so that we wouldn't suffer in the next one. And that's the one that we're looking for, and that's the one that we struggle with, and that's the one that if anybody is an example, Paul is an example of how a person can be such a strong Christian, such an active worker in the kingdom, and still have to swim the shore, still have to fight lions in Ephesus, still have to spend time in prison in Philippi. If Al had come here with this resume, could y'all have hired him, been in prison, started riots, get whipped many, many times for preaching the gospel. You know, it's not a resume that looks good on paper, but it's a resume that looks good in heaven. So triumph in sufferings shows others that we believe in a God who cares.
If you suffer with Christ, you reign with Christ.
That's exactly what it says too. And you know, you would have thought it would have been an easy and an eventful trip to Rome, but if it had not been the way that it was, and Al talked about this in his sermon on providence. We always think of God's providence as being the good things that happen to us. But this was God's providence too. That westerly wind blew for a long time, and it blew them all off course. And then the northwester turned around and blew them even worse. But if this had not happened, hundreds of people would not have seen the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Hundreds of people would not have gotten to witness firsthand Paul talking about the kingdom of God and salvation. And so that's one of the reasons I think we suffer, is so that other people can be saved. We will be saved. We know that. But this is so that others will be saved because they see how we endure through our sufferings, triumphal sufferings. And that's what I have. I did a kind of an epilogue. These prison epistles, once he was locked up there, he wrote some letters back to some churches. In Colossians, we learned that he wrote a letter to the church in Laodicea, and that they were supposed to swap that letter. They were supposed to exchange that letter, the one that he wrote to Colossians. Some people think that letter was the one that he wrote to the Ephesians, but it either is or we have a letter that's missing, and we've had that before with the Corinthians too. So these were the 4 epistles that were written from prison in that era, 62 to 63 AD. And in Colossians, it also tells us that Aristarchus was with him, that Luke was with him, and some of the others, that Demas was with him even at that time. Demas we see, and Timothy leaves Paul. But that's later on. That's a couple of years later on down the way. But we see that these other people are involved in it, and that's one of the things of being able to read other places in the New Testament and connect them with the things that are going on in Acts. Complementary to each other, the things that are done in Acts we've seen kind of fill in some of the holes in some of the other epistles. Some of the epistles fill in some of the holes in Acts. So, you know, they really go together well with each other. This is the end. This is all we have of Acts. Is there any questions that you had through this whole, I don't know, how long have we been at it? A year? 22 lessons, at least 22 weeks, so maybe only half a year. We'll split up.
It sounds to me like the Roman centurion might have either been a Christian or he heard of Paul's preaching.
Yeah, the Roman, that was unusual for a centurion with a bunch of prisoners to pick out one and treat him kindly. I think he recognized something in Paul that like Potiphar did or like the jailer did. There's Paul just was different than other run-of-the-mill worldly people. He glowed with Christ. He had Christ shining through him like probably nobody else of that time. People recognize that.
And the miracles that he performed,
And the miracles.
Unnoticed.
Absolutely. You can't ignore those.
It also shows God uses people who do not follow just as well as people that follow.
a good point too. We've seen that throughout the scriptures too, of God using people that aren't Christians to accomplish the things that he wants to accomplish through Christians. And that might be in order for them to be saved. You know, they might see that that is taking place. It's been a really good study. I have some ideas for what we want to do going into the new year, but if you've got some ideas too of a place that you would like to study, something that you would like you think would be beneficial for the group, I'm going to talk to the elders to see what direction they want, they would like me to go in. But I would also appreciate input from y'all, because you're the ones that show up every day. I'm going to be here whether y'all come or not, but I'm preaching or teaching. I like to see a lot of pews filled, and I'm sure Al does too. So, you know,
You're a very good teacher, and I really enjoy the lessons.
Thank you, Larry. I really appreciate that. I enjoy studying God's word, and I know that I don't know it as well as I need to. So that's what keeps me going, and the encouragement from y'all.
But I read over a lot of that stuff, even the ship. I was just wondering in my mind, I said, did they repair that other boat, or how did they get on another ship?
Yeah,
I overread it. I read that in there, but I didn't catch it.
it's sitting at the bottom of the Adriatic Sea, stuck on some reef, and just like all these other shipwrecks that we hear that are off of the coast of, you know, North Carolina, loaded down full of gold. You can keep looking for them and keep finding them. Thank you very much. And that's it. Y'all are dismissed. Get ready for lunch.